Very good. Thank you very much for coming tonight. It's not the nicest night to be outside, so we really appreciate being here. I'm Martha Taylor, the Planning Director for the town of Newbury, and this will be the next in a series of sessions working towards the update of our housing production plan. We had one virtual session back in
October 12th.
Sorry, we had a session on the MBTA communities, and tonight will be a more general discussion, and Laura will outline the sort of the sequence of events tonight. So there'll be a little bit of presentation and an opportunity to provide feedback. So I'd like to turn it over to Laura Keesley, Community and Economic Development and BPC.
Sorry, and that was my grand entrance of unplugging the projector as we get started. So as that boots up again, apologies. As Martha was saying, I'm Laura Keesling. I'm the community planner with the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission. Hello again to those of you who are at our virtual session on the 12th, and to those of you who have been attending the various MBTA communities forums as well. Welcome back to the space. I know you've been a lot more acquainted with Kayla during those discussions than myself. But I have been heading up alongside Kayla our housing production plan update for the region. Again, the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission is your regional planning agency. We're one of 15 different RPAs across the state. And we are tasked with being a public entity to expand the capacity for our local municipal planners and provide technical assistance for a variety of planning issues. And in our particular department, the Community and Economic Development Department, what our bread and butter right now has been updating each of our cities and towns, 15 various housing production plans that are on a 5-year cycle. We'll go into a little bit more about what an HUP is and what its utility is, as well as helping 8 of our communities with the MBTA communities compliance. So this evening gives us the opportunity to kind of merge those two things together. We're not only talking a little bit more about MBTA communities, answering some questions you may have following those initial sessions, but also just gathering your general feedback about your concerns around housing production in Newbury, what your aspirations are, what your hopes are, and some of your responses to the data we'll be presenting this evening as well. We do also have, again, we'll walk through the activities in a moment, but some draft strategies that we're hoping to incorporate into your housing production plan per the expert advice and insight from Martha and Kristen, respectively. So excited to hear your feedback on those as well. But we will get underway now. I'm going to start by moving through our agenda. Again, we won't be presenting very long, I can guarantee. We're really hoping tonight is way more hands-on, conversation-based, getting you up and out of your seats. So we'll only be up here for about 15 more minutes, just again, going through Newbury's current housing landscape, showing you some data that you may have already seen at some of the MBTA community sessions, and then answering any questions about that. Then we will open up for our sort of open house portion of the evening, where again, you can answer questions, participate in some of the activities we have, and then we'll go from there. So again, I feel like we already went through who we are, but again, this could not be possible without our partnership with both Martha and Kristen and your planning department here in Newbury. We do have the unique opportunity to not only be doing your HUP, but also your MBTA communities compliance, and some other technical assistance work. So I feel like we've been very well acquainted with Newbury from a planning context over the last year, and we're definitely grateful to be here tonight. So what is a housing production plan? I am curious, just by a show of hands, of who in here is familiar with Newbury's 2018 housing production plan. If you've seen it, if you've read it, if you've loved it.
It's about 70 pages long.
Yeah, it's about 70 pages. So again, an HUP, and the one that Newbury currently has, is used that serves a dual purpose. So the one is to act as a comprehensive plan to articulate the specific vision in Newbury for what your housing priorities might look like, especially over time. It is a very data-rich document that's essentially showing your demographic profile, your age and population projections over time, what your area median income looks like, kind of stratified out, to help inform what the housing needs of the future, or really over the next 5 years, might look like. Again, we are in the update process, so we've essentially been taking the information and the strategies proposed in your 2018 plan and adapting them to fit 2024 at this point. The other purpose, other than just having an HUP as good planning practice, again, an opportunity to talk to residents about what your priorities are and have them in a municipal document, it also does have a statutory utility with the state. So if folks are familiar with Chapter 40B development, again, Chapter 40B has been around since 1979. It's the state's primary tool for encouraging building of multifamily and affordable housing throughout the Commonwealth. You probably are familiar with 40B development just as a term, but also in your neighboring town and in your town as well. Having a approved HUP, both on the local and state level, can grant you one aspect of a kind of a three-tiered system towards what's called safe harbor status, which essentially says you have an HUP in hand, it's been approved locally, and you're also producing housing at 0.5 to 1% per calendar year. This is something that's outlined in the plan itself, that you can be granted sort of protection against 40B development. Essentially, if they came in with a comprehensive permit, that can be denied by your zoning board of appeals. But again, not only do you need that HUP in hand, but you also need to be having that housing production as shown to the state over time, proving that you are indeed producing affordable housing. So as you can see in this last bullet here, and again, if you're familiar with it, please forgive me, there is a statutory minimum of 10% affordable housing, and that specifically means housing that makes it onto what's called your subsidized housing inventory. I believe Newbury is somewhere around 3 or 4%, and again, quote me on that.
3.1.
3.1.
2010 census. So
Okay, so it definitely is different now, but there's definitely room for growth, as with most of the communities in the Merrimack Valley. So that is another utility that the HUP can serve, is your sort of roadmap to achieving that 10%. Initial questions about the HUP itself as a planning tool, or about the process overall? Please.
I'm just curious with the rate, the 0.5 to 1%, is that an annual rate or is that?
It is an annual rate, and it's also based on your housing stock. So again, something that we don't have the information tonight, but in your final plan, it essentially shows you like 2024, 2025, how many units would be equivalent to your total. Usually in our smaller towns, it's roughly 10 or less units per, just given the population of existing housing units here, but it is on an annual basis, yes. Other questions or comments before we dive into some data? Excellent. We have all night for questions as well, so if anything comes up. I'm going to hand it over to Kayla to talk about some of Newbury's housing needs.
All right, so just to start off here, we wanted to show you some age distribution projections for the town. So something to point out, the first two numbers we have here are for the census in 2010 and 2020. So these are going to be your actual numbers for your population at those points in time. But we have some projections here going to 2030 and 2040 here as well, which shows based on trends from about the last 10 years, what kind of age distributions you would see in town. So something to focus on here and point out is this blue line we have right here, which is your 65 plus and older population. We see this actually pretty consistently across our towns in the Merrimack Valley, where you have this aging population. And it's something for us to keep in mind when we think about housing needs in the community. What kind of age distribution are we looking at here? Of course, you're going to have certain different needs with an aging population. You might want to have opportunities and housing strategies for aging in place. But there might also be opportunities to look at other things like congregate living, community-based living, where you have those kind of cottage-style houses. Something to think about when we think about the types of housing we want to see in a community is looking at what that age distribution breakdown could look like. Again, this is very typical for a lot of our smaller towns in the Merrimack Valley. So something to just keep in mind as we think about what are the future needs for the community and how can we address those kind of housing needs with specific housing types. Something to also keep in mind as well when we look at your occupancy data. A fact that we like to point out here is looking at this 1 and 2 person household part of the pie chart right here, that blue and yellow color. 1 or 2 person households make up about 60% of your population, out of your homes. And then you also have right here in the bedrooms per housing unit count, about 1 to 2 bedroom homes make up about 28% of your housing stock. So what does this mean? Right now, we're seeing a very high percentage of your population in this 1 to 2 person household category, but there's not a lot of these 1 to 2 bedroom units. Now, what this might mean, which we see across a lot of our communities, is you might have a couple where maybe their children don't live there anymore, it's just the 2 of them, maybe they have a 4-bedroom house, and they want to stay in their home, keep room for their grandkids to visit, and that's totally fine. We expect that there's going to be a little bit of a mismatch between these 2 pie charts in a lot of our community. However, something to think about is if you do have, say, a 2-person household where maybe they don't want to keep their big home, maybe they want to have some downsize opportunities, or maybe you have a young couple that's starting out, they might just want, a 1 or 2 bedroom unit before they move into that bigger home eventually. So something that we think about a lot is when you have this mismatch between these 2 charts here, you're going to have a higher percentage of your population competing for fewer money units. And that kind of mismatch between the supply and demand can cause what we call kind of a filtering issue where, if you have a couple, they might want to downsize. If they don't have any opportunity to, if they don't have that chance in their community where they want to stay, they're going to stay in their home, which means that home might not be available if a young couple wants to move in and they want to start their family there. So we're seeing a little bit of a lack of filtering in a lot of our communities. And again, we're not saying anybody has to downsize or change their housing type or anything like that. It's just something to think about when we think about addressing some of these needs. How can we create some of these opportunities for folks if they want to do something like that? So what are we talking about here when we talk about housing types? So this is a good graphic that explains something we call missing middle housing. So on the left side here, you're going to have your detached single-family homes. This makes up the majority of the housing types that we see across our small towns in the Merrimack Valley. On the right side here, you're going to see your mid-rise housing types. This is something we see more in our gateway cities and kind of close to that Boston corridor. We're not talking about this kind of housing either. What we're really focusing on is this missing middle housing right here. So what we're talking about here is duplexes, fourplexes, that kind of cottage style building as I talked about before, townhouses, triplexes, things like that. So looking at how we can address some of that missing middle housing and providing opportunity for some of these additional housing types, that might be something that's needed in a community like Newbury. So some real world examples of what this could look like when you think about multifamily housing. We don't necessarily have to think about what we call those like shoebox apartments where they're just 7 stories tall and 1 big box. We want to see something that really fits the character of our towns. A couple examples from our region here. We have some new construction right in the downtown of Georgetown. And this is again considered multifamily because these units are all attached here. North Andover, this is actually a conversion of an existing home. It was converted into 6 ownership units recently. So this is a great example of taking, I believe it was a single-family home, and turning it into something that still fits the character of the neighborhood, but adds a couple units that weren't there before. Natick is also a great example of this. I'll hop over here for a sec. If you can see these 2 houses at the front here, those were existing homes that had been converted similar to North Andover. So when you're seeing from the front, you're really only seeing those 2 houses right there. But they got creative with the rest of the property because they have some more of this dense multifamily housing set kind of further back from the street. So just something to think about here when we think about multifamily housing, we talk about MBTA communities, things like that. I really want folks to kind of think about some of these examples that we've shown here of what multifamily housing could look like in your community.
Thanks so much, Kayla. We'll pause here again for any initial questions or reactions to any of the data or themes that Kayla talked about. Please.
The apartment complex down by the Newbury Port train station, is that a multi-complex?
It is, yes, and we would classify it, let me actually go back to middle housing. When you go towards that kind of mid-rise situation outside of the missing middle housing range, that is definitely just dense apartment living, mostly studio and 1 beds. That is kind of the characteristic of the 1 Boston Way, soon to be 3 Boston Way as well. And again, that was done, due to the utility of having that very high density near the commuter rail. But it's certainly not something that I think, based on initial knowledge of your community, that would necessarily fit the character or the tone, especially if you don't have a commuter rail station here, things of that nature. But it definitely would kind of be outside of that missing middle. Sure, please.
The demographics show, an aging population, and then a lot of the middle housing are all vertical structures. I'm just curious of the middle housing options, which of those tend to be best for an aging population?
Yeah.
One floor living.
Sure, excellent question. Definitely at first glance, your duplexes would be that first, right? Because they don't necessarily have to be multi-level. They could technically be that single floor living, accessible entryways, etc. I will say that this graphic doesn't show kind of all the housing types that are potential. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be multifamily or attached structures. Something that, again, we can actually talk about when we talk more about strategies later on, is what's called a starter home district or something of that nature that goes hand in hand with potentially reducing minimum lot size in any residential zoning area to allow for those smaller single-family homes, which could potentially be that single-floor ranch type of situation. So there is room for accessibility, and certainly for aging folks within a multifamily structure, but there's also a lot of opportunity for denser single-family living as well if you were to change, let's say, minimum lot size and allow that type of design.
And then with the unit count to meet the state statutes, are any of those in particular used more often than others to try to get unit counts up?
I would say typically, so the way that the SHI works is kind of funky. If you do have a multifamily building, so let's actually use Newbury as an example, because they do have inclusionary zoning. That building is, I think, just under 90 units. Again, that higher density, they have their 12% inclusionary zoning. They're actually able to count all of the units in that building for their subsidized housing inventory and not just the affordable ones. It's just a stipulation within the statutory requirements. So if you do have more units within one building, even if they're majority market rate, you can technically count those towards your 10% minimum.
What's the rationale of that?
That's a really good question. I'm not quite sure. I think that was written into 40B, again, back when it was first written. And it does provide communities a way to, right, it's not necessarily showing their true affordable housing percentage, which is very valid, and I think a lot of communities do have internal methods of tracking that, even something that wouldn't make it on the SHI, like naturally occurring affordable housing, etc. They could have internal tracking for that, but for the state's purposes, it does count the whole development. Did someone else over here? Yes, please.
On the handover 6-unit, was that with city sewage?
With city sewer,
Did they have city sewage?
I'm assuming, I think all of North Andover has town sewer, but I'm not entirely certain.
Yeah,
Right
don't
now.
quote us on it. I think
Yeah,
so.
we can do some research on that.
Yes.
But we can assume that yes, they did have a town hookup there.
Okay, and when I was managing the housing, there was a big gap for the people the older people that wanted to stay in the area, but they were over income, but they still wanted to live somewhere where snow would be removed.
Yep.
But they couldn't afford the higher end condos.
Yep.
So in your areas, what have you seen that best fits them?
Yeah, great, a really good observation. So I think what you're alluding to is the difference between like income restricted senior housing versus, let's say, just naturally occurring either affordable or market rate units. We will say that, again, housing prices across the board are very, very high, even when you're in sort of that more congregate townhouse style living situation. However, we do follow the logic of if we do increase housing density and housing availability, that competition will lessen. Therefore, hopefully, we would see a decrease in those market values over time, aka allowing more folks to kind of get their foot in the door. What we've been seeing for a lot of folks is, right, people who are leaving their, let's say, 3-4 bedroom home, their home value has appreciated exponentially over the last, let's say, if they lived in for 30 years, and that something within a townhouse style, within most of our mid-sized and smaller towns, would still be relatively affordable given, the equity that they're carrying over. I would say, I don't want to quote for Georgetown here, but we actually were just doing some information about economic feasibility just around the region. So we've been on Zillow, Redfin, Apartments.com, kind of seeing what the going rates are. In those units, those townhouses are still around 350 or 300 right now, which again, just compared to a standalone single-family home, I can't believe I'm saying it, but it's still relatively affordable in this market, right? And we're definitely seeing that with more attached units. So it's a mix. But I will say that a lot of our communities are still in the beginning stages of having opportunities like that. So we don't have a ton of excellent references to show a success story at this point, since we're just starting to change zoning at this point.
Thank you.
Sure. Questions at this point? Yes, please.
And this Martha might be able to help out with this, but what is the minimum lot size allowed in Newbury right now?
Currently in our residential district and most of the other districts, it's 40,000 square feet for single family, 60,000 for a two-family if there's public water supply, and 80,000 if there's for two-family if there's no public water.
So 40,000 square feet, how does that compare to like an acre, for example?
That is,
So it's a builder's acre.
40,000 is just under an acre?
Yeah.
I think that what I've noticed is my dad built a home on High Road in the middle 50s, and his house lot was 100 by 100, and it was in Newbury. And then since that time, we've evolved into wanting to have the minimum lot size at an acre, just because we wanted to maintain this rural town feel and look. So I think I heard you say that, I don't know, not you personally,
Oh, yeah.
but like the state
Yeah.
would prefer that we shrink that back down to a half acre or a quarter acre, or to allow to compact more homes into a smaller geographical area. Is that what we're talking about?
So it's definitely a tool in the toolbox. I think my initial response is that it does, reducing minimum lot size does follow a quote unquote like state zoning best practice, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to fit the character of all the towns in the Commonwealth. Something that we typically talk about when we're talking about lot size is the reason that we're seeing kind of, your larger single family home on, let's say, an acre plus area of land that's selling, your McMansions, for example, your very expensive homes, is because the cost of building even a single family house on that land, because of the cost of land, causes it to need to be sold for that amount. So there's kind of two prongs that I'm getting at here. One is that potentially larger lot sizes could be better serviced if multifamily housing was allowed, including duplexes all the way up to a townhouse style situation, so that developers could essentially get more bang for the buck with building on that land, but therefore also build more units in that area. When we're talking about smaller lot sizes, that gives another opportunity because that land is costing less because it's in a smaller area to build, again, perhaps those smaller single-family homes, those 1,200 square foot type of houses. But it's all definitely an economics game, and it really all comes down to the cost of land per square foot, which in this area is pretty astronomical, as market conditions are right now. The other thing I'll mention, just to share information, is that it doesn't necessarily mean that every residential or mixed-use zone in town would have to accommodate that smaller minimum lot size. It would be determined, between the public, planning board, et cetera, about what areas of town can be best suited for development that might kind of fit that smaller lot size. And then you're going to see that development over time. These things take decades really to materialize into, let's say, if we changed a 2-acre zoning neighborhood to a smaller one, you're not going to see that type of development until someone sells their house, sells the land, et cetera, to see that build out. So I know that's kind of an information dump, but that's kind of the main answer to your question is it can vary town by town, and it doesn't necessarily have to be across all areas of town, but it's just one tool to consider in thinking about, allowing for development of different housing types.
We also do see something else in our small towns a lot too, is that kind of cluster residential development where you'll have on a big parcel, the housing is concentrated in one area, while the rest of it, you're preserving open space and, some amenities like that. So that's something that we've seen in a lot of our towns as well, where having the housing kind of clustered in one area of the parcel allows it to, you can still have a good amount of housing on that one area, but you're having those smaller sized houses. So that's something that we've seen as a strategy as well, is kind of dividing lots like that, so they're a little smaller.
Sure, over here.
For people who have, let's say, have a larger home, or they would like to stay in their home, what if they had an in-law, something like that? Would that be encouraged or discouraged? Would they?
Absolutely encouraged. Would you like to speak to that a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah, repeat
I can't hear the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. For folks who would like to stay, for aging folks who would like to stay in their home, is it encouraged to create an accessory apartment to accommodate that?
Yeah, so we do have an accessory apartment bylaw. It's been on our books for quite some time. It does not require that a blood relative live there. It can be rental, and we're certainly trying to encourage developers when they come in to consider adding accessory apartments, or any homeowners who are interested to explore that. We allow them both attached or within the existing primary dwelling, or in a separate structure like over a garage or a barn or something like that. So that's definitely encouraged.
And it wouldn't have to be a relative.
It does not have to be a relative.
But Martha,
Sorry.
Maybe in the middle, we need a microphone.
Sorry, the other question was, it does not need to be a relative to live in that ADU per se. Newbury does not have that restriction.
but Martha, you can't use that as your stock, right, for your count.
For your subsidized housing inventory, it would have to be deed restricted, so it doesn't automatically
Right.
get on housing inventory.
Please.
Also, I have a question about developers and the builders. Is there any credit given to local build contractors and local builders above huge national companies?
So the question was about developers and builders. Is there preference given to, can you use the term again? I'm sorry.
Local.
Local builders
Local
versus
builders.
larger entities
National companies.
and national companies.
Multi-billion dollar companies.
Right. And Martha can fill in on this. I know that there's been many conversations with some local nonprofits, including, I believe, Habitat for Humanity, maybe Harbor Light has been in the conversation as well, about building housing specifically in Newbury. I don't think there's anything that's required for a local builder, but we certainly see that very commonly across the Merrimack Valley with our small scale developers kind of also being a lot more active, I think, at planning board and kind of walking through that site plan review process really closely. So there definitely is a good utilization of local builders, but I'm not sure if you want to add.
No, I think that, we haven't given any preference to local builders. Certainly we encourage the local builders to work with us, because they're familiar with the area.
See, the number of the new homes that are being built are all the same style, and they're rather boring.
Yeah, that's the trend these days. They call it modern farmhouse, and everybody seems to be
Sorry,
doing that.
can you guys repeat?
Of course, the comment was that it seems like a lot of the homes that are being built now all look the same, and it's a little bit boring, character-wise. We just have 2 more slides for you until we open up into the open house, where again, this is a great start to this discussion. We just wanted to give a really brief overview of some of the housing goals from Newbury's master plan, which was recently completed last year, and then also some of Newbury's most recent housing accomplishments, just to give you the scope for our conversation about appropriate strategies. So these are the 6 goals identified in the master plan, and as we've been working through the draft updated housing production plan strategies, we've been pulling directly from your master plan to bind these 2 plans together. So the first here is increasing the diversity of housing options, meaning again, diversity of housing types, for seniors, downsizers, starter homes, everyone in between, making sure that Newbury has those options available. The second here is increasing the supply of affordable housing just outright. Expanding water and sewer infrastructure capacity to serve more diverse housing, and I believe that already came up about whether or not someone was on town sewer, so that's definitely a consideration for Newbury without that public sewer capacity, and requires the town to think a little bit creatively about what that could look like to support potentially denser, and more diverse housing. Reducing the vulnerability of Newbury's housing stock to climate-related storm damage, right? So especially pertinent as a coastal community. So definitely something that we are considering within your housing production strategies about, utilizing climate resiliency in the building of those structures, potentially in design guidelines, et cetera. Expanding local awareness and support for your housing needs, and encouraging housing development that preserves natural and cultural resources. Again, Kayla had mentioned earlier about the utilization of what's called open space residential development. Newbury has a really good track record of using OSRD, where you're able to have that smaller cluster development on a larger parcel, but perhaps there's conservation lands and green space around that, so you're still preserving that character and culture and amenity, but again, increasing your housing stock at the same time. And lastly, just a quick list of some initiatives in production that have happened in Newbury since your last housing production plan. Again, your master plan update last year. Really big deal, especially for a small town within our region. We don't have a lot of towns with an updated master plan, so kudos on that. You've seen more building and permitting for accessory apartments and 2-family units. You do allow 2-family units, is that right? Is it by right? By right across town, so you are seeing utilization of that opportunity. 6 new residential developments have been permitted since 2018, resulting in 28 new single-family homes. So Newbury is building housing, and I'm curious to hear how that is resonating with all of you when we open up for conversation. 1 new residential development is currently in permitting with 4 proposed new single-family houses as well. And then you do have a comprehensive permit, or Chapter 40B, which is what we talked about in the beginning, for a 24-unit development with 6 affordable units issued by your zoning board of appeals. So those units would count towards your SHI once they are completed. So Newbury has been doing the work, and we're excited to see, what more tools, what other tools we can add to the toolbox. Please. Really good question. So when we say affordable, we're really talking about affordability of all types. We can talk about uppercase A affordable, which is something that could make it onto your subsidized housing inventory. That's typically units that are available to folks making 80% of the area median income or below. There's also lowercase affordable, which means just naturally occurring. So when folks are renting or owning a certain property, their monthly expenses are under 30% of their gross income, so that it's quote unquote affordable to them. In this case, in the HUP lingo, we're typically talking about that uppercase A, so under that 80% AMI. But for the purpose of tonight's conversation, we're kind of weaving all of that together, because we want to be able to create housing stock that is affordable, not necessarily income restricted affordable, but affordable, you know what I mean, by all sense of the word of maybe I can stay in my community, I can afford my rent, I can afford my taxes, etc. So that's the caveat. That's not a really good answer because it's so fluid, but all of that is welcome this evening.
And what would that, it's median income for the area?
That's right. I forget the income limits. I believe because you're in technically the Boston metro area, it is standardized kind of on a regional basis. If you're thinking of, just to put it in perspective, a 1-person bedroom at 80% AMI, I believe the income cap is around $75K a year. So it might be
At the 80%?
Of the 80%, yeah, because the area median income for the Boston metro, I believe, is around 110 in that area. So yeah, we are talking about pretty high annual salaries, and especially when we're thinking about our folks who work in municipal services, our firefighters, our teachers. We know that especially when folks are first starting out, they're way below that 75. So just thinking about what deeper affordability could look like in that context as well.
It's actually $94,000 per 2-person. So just put that in context. If you look at a young couple, for example, maybe they're a firefighter and a teacher. That's what we're talking about here.
Please.
Where is the 24-unit building going?
That's at the end of Pearson Drive.
I don't know if this listed here relate to the 0.5 to 1% production increase per year. Is this like smashing it out of the park? Is it still under that rate? It seems like it's under. I mean, six developments, 20 houses since 2018.
Great. I would say that, and Martha, is the 40B, the 24 units connected, they're considered multifamily.
They're single.
They're single family. Okay, thank you for clarifying. I would say that you're inching towards that 0.5. I wish I had the numbers in front of me, so excuse me for not being completely accurate. But you're definitely on the right track. again, for Newbury, I know those numbers are relatively small, so I would say you're probably just under that 0.5, but again, I will, I can actually have that production schedule done pretty soon and can distribute that to folks as well. Yes?
There was a really good article in the Daily News today, and it explains a lot of this, especially the A&I issue, which, I mean, my son's at $28,000 a year. I don't know how we're gonna make the connection there, to be quite honest. And then the other point I have is the State of the State address that the governor had a couple weeks ago, and then the budget that just got rolled out for the state of Massachusetts. How, that has to have an impact on your programs. And I'm just curious what kind of impact it has, and is the state going to revisit some of this because we don't have any, but the state doesn't have any money.
Really good question. So we are hoping that, especially with the new administration and the housing bond bill that was also proposed, I believe it's in deliberation right now, that there'll be pretty large waves in terms of grant funding to help support some of this. It's going to include technical assistance, right, to help implement zoning changes alongside residents, especially if you're in a town meeting format, providing those resources externally to help planning staff kind of move communities towards this. We're also hoping to see, there's mention of potentially creating an accessory dwelling unit ordinance by right statewide. That's another tool in the toolbox, as well as just funding availability for gap financing for a variety of affordable housing projects. Again, we sit with our fingers crossed about what that could actually look like, but we do know it is on the governor's mind. It really just, depends on what makes it out of deliberation in that final publishing of the bill. But we know that there is money and prospective outlook for this type of housing in the future. We just don't know exactly what that will look like right now. Sure. Great. I think we're ready to open it up, kind of stretch our legs and go to each station. So just as a really brief overview, on the left-hand side, kind of towards the exit door there, you'll see our housing production plan strategy prioritization. We did take a small sample of the strategies we're currently working on just to get a sense of how folks are responding to them. That activity is pretty much, a sticker situation, so you can choose your top 2 out of those just to give us a sense of what's resonating with you. I'll be staffing that one to kind of talk to you about your choices and hear more from you. In the middle here is more of our general catch-all section of saying, what are your general thoughts about housing production in Newbury? What are your concerns? Again, what would you like to see? Anything that we're missing in our strategy list? That is your opportunity to write that down or talk to us about anything that we're missing and should be considered in the plan. And then over here, we do have a mapping exercise for you to kind of map out potential areas that you think, from your perspective, might be best suited for housing of all types, of mainly multifamily or affordable housing within the town. And we'll also be utilizing that map. Kayla's going to draw out the boundaries for your proposed MBTA communities districts. So we'll also have that type of conversation in this area of the room. But again, couching that in with general housing production locations overall, in addition to your MBTA communities districts. Please. Yep.
Maybe this is a question for over there, but are they considering doing any building on Plum Island?
For MBTA communities or just in general?
Well, for the first thing you said.
Yeah, so for MBTA communities, no, we're not looking at any areas of, I only want to give the caveat because if anybody points out any areas around there that you want to see housing, that might be a conversation if there's general housing that people want to see in certain areas. That's why I just want to clarify, but no, for MBTA, we're not looking for any areas around Plum Island.
Right, and just to clarify, Plum Island, the only thing that's allowed by right is single-family homes right now, so I think it's not an area that would lend itself towards multifamily.
How about the auxiliary housing, what do you call it?
Accessory apartments.
Accessory, yeah.
I think that's also, I think the opportunities for that are also limited on Plum Island.
And why is that? We have water and sewer now.
I think that a lot of it really goes to what was allowed in terms of the betterments for the water and sewer. And trying not to overburden the system.
Oh, okay.
So again, folks, we will let you loose. We'll go to our respective stations. We'll kind of be floating between them. But again, feel free to talk to us one-on-one, kind of participate in the activities, ask us any questions. And thanks again for being here. We'll go through this, and then we'll likely, probably 10 minutes of 8, if folks are still here, do a quick wrap-up and hear from each station just about lessons learned. But other than that, feel free to pick your station, and also to help yourself to refreshments in the back as well.
It's some deep roots here, so looking at the school issues, school budget.
But also I have access.
Oh, wait, long story, but we had a house away for 4
Which area are you talking about? The Scotland Road.